One dark night in 1943, in the pitch-black ocean, Germany's U-boat fleet believed it was invisible. But from the sky, B-24 Liberators silently swept the waves with a new weapon, microwave radar. Within just a few hours, the entire U-boat formation turned into burning dots on the sea. Admiral Dönitz's confidence was shattered. Dusk, September 3, 1939. Off the North Atlantic, the passenger liner SS Athenia was cutting through the waves, bound for Montreal. The massive ship, carrying more than 1,000 passengers, still pulsed with children's laughter, the sound of a piano in the dining hall, and the mingled scents of fine liquor and cigarette smoke drifting from the first-class bar. None of them knew that just a few hundred yards beneath the black water, a steel shadow was quietly stalking them. Inside the control room of U-boat U-30, Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp squinted through the periscope. Before him, a civilian vessel loomed clearly into view. Lemp hesitated. The Athenia was not a military target, but Berlin had issued the order. Make the seas tremble from the very first day. His hands clenched tight as he gave the command that history would remember as the opening shot of one of the longest and bloodiest battles ever fought. Fire! A torpedo shot out, racing forward and leaving behind a trail of icy white bubbles. 1 second, 2 seconds, then a blast tore the ocean apart. The Athenia shuddered violently, her hull cracking wide as a pillar of flame shot skyward. Passengers screamed in panic. That night, 117 lives were lost forever to the cold Atlantic depths. News of the sinking instantly shocked the world. America was outraged as 28 of its citizens were among the dead. In London, the public was stunned. War had begun less than a single day, and already the Atlantic was stained with blood. People called it a sneak attack by the ghosts beneath the sea. And soon, the word U-boat became a terrifying curse, the name of death in the deep ocean. In Liverpool's harbour taverns, old sailors who had survived the First World War muttered grimly through clouded eyes. They rise out of the fog, fire a spear of steel, then vanish. You'll see nothing but white foam and bodies drifting in the tide. For the Germans, however, the U-boat was a new source of pride. After their defeat in the First World War, and despite the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty, they had secretly nurtured a generation of brilliant submarine engineers. When Hitler seized power, those limits were cast aside, and Karl Dönitz, the father of the sea wolves, built a fleet beneath the waves, silent but deadly. His strategy was brutally simple: sink as many merchant ships as possible. Victory or defeat does not depend on big battleships, but on the tonnage sent to the bottom, Dönitz declared. Cold calculations had shown that if just 800,000 tons of cargo disappeared into the sea each month, Britain, a nation that lived or died on trade, would collapse into hunger. And in the early months, the plan worked with machine-like precision. October 1940. Amid the grey Atlantic fog, convoy SC-7, 35 merchant ships loaded with coal, food, oil and steel, plodded toward Britain. Their escort was pitiful, only a few small destroyers crewed by exhausted sailors, lacking manpower, radar, and even experience. Night fell. The U-boats gathered. Dönitz's Wolfpack tactic came alive. By day, the subs shadowed the convoy, quietly reporting positions to headquarters. By night, they struck together in a coordinated frenzy. On the bridge of a Norwegian freighter, the captain heard a thunderous boom echo through the dark, followed by a violent shudder of his ship's hull. Another vessel beside him had just taken a torpedo hit. Sirens wailed. Crewmen rushed to lower lifeboats, but suddenly a fireball erupted, swallowing ship and sailors alike. Men in life jackets hurled themselves into the frigid sea, screaming as the freezing salt water bit into their flesh. That night, 17 ships went down. The ocean glowed with burning wrecks, like a vast floating crematorium. Survivors would forever call it the night of the slaughter. For the Germans, it was the happy time when their U-boats prowled freely like hungry wolves. In the underground war room in London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill stood motionless before a map, its surface crowded with red pins scattered across the Atlantic. He murmured, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." His fear was not misplaced. In the very first year, nearly 1,000 merchant ships were sent to the bottom. The killers were none other than the German submarines. Britain faced catastrophe. Wheat, oil, weapons, everything seemed cut off. Families in London stared at ration cards growing thinner by the week, while out at sea, young sailors sailed off knowing they might never return. British sailors called the U-boat a ghost, because no one ever saw them until a deadly torpedo had already slammed into a ship's belly. The primitive Aztec sonar worked only at short range, and patrol aircraft had little chance of detecting those engines of death beneath the Atlantic. For the Royal Navy, every voyage had become a gamble, and most of the time they lost. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Dönitz stepped out onto a balcony, looking down at the tens of thousands of citizens cheering the return of the Knights of the Ocean. U-boat crews were hailed as heroes, lone warriors defying the mighty British Empire. In the German press, they were celebrated as the immortal sea wolves. In Hamburg's beer halls, people sang loud ballads about Günther Prien's U-47, the sub that had slipped into Scapa Flow and sunk the battleship Royal Oak. The names Prien, Kretschmer, Schepke were glorified no less than the Luftwaffe's fighter aces. But behind the glamour lay a grim truth. Life inside a submarine was cramped and damp, the smell of oil mingling with sweat. Sailors slept on top of torpedoes, shared a single toilet, and breathed air heavy with battery fumes. Still, they laughed and sang because they all believed the U-boat was invincible. By 1941, the tide began to turn. The British quietly pieced together a new system from scattered parts. Enigma code-breaking at Bletchley Park, improved sonar, aircraft factories in Sunderland, and above all, secret experiments with high-frequency radar. In a small room bathed in yellow light in Birmingham, scientists clustered around a strange device called the magnetron. Each time the switch was flipped, it sent out short pulses that rattled the walls. A young engineer exclaimed, "If this thing can be mounted on an aircraft, the U-boats will have nowhere left to hide." Churchill called it his miracle secret and ordered absolute silence about it. He knew that if this new radar succeeded, it would be the sword to slash through the fangs of the sea wolves. But for the time being, the U-boats still roamed free. In the summer of 1942, just as America had entered the war, they were dealt a painful blow. German subs surfaced right off the coast of New York, firing not only torpedoes, but also deck guns. Skyscrapers loomed like easy targets. Americans watched with their own eyes as merchant ships exploded just offshore, realizing that the war in Europe had reached their very doorstep. In the concrete bunker at Lorient, Dönitz sat before a map, smiling coldly. Officers reported, "This month we sank 800,000 tons of enemy shipping." He nodded, his eyes gleaming. The strategy he had devised was working brilliantly. What he did not know was that beyond the foggy skies, a storm of technology was gathering. And when that storm broke, his entire empire of sea wolves would be shattered within months. The Atlantic Ocean, vast, cold, and merciless, had become the graveyard of tens of thousands of sailors. To the Germans, it was the stage where the U-boat shone, turning its crews into legends. To the British, it was an abyss of despair, where every lifeline of vital cargo could vanish in an instant. But history rarely favours those who grow too confident. In the shadows of the laboratories, microwave radar was waiting for its moment. And once it was unleashed, the sea wolves that once seemed invisible would taste the very terror they had inflicted on their enemies. In the deep bunker beneath the city of Lorient, Once a bustling French fishing port, now the command centre of an undersea war, Admiral Karl Dönitz stood before a map of the Atlantic. Small black flags were pinned to specific coordinates, each one marking a U-boat silently moving through the vast ocean depths. The yellow light cast shadows across his rugged face. Dönitz was not the flamboyant type of commander like Goering, nor did he possess the aristocratic air of the panzer generals. He resembled an old wolf, cold, relentless, and enduring. His dark, sunken eyes reflected a single obsession: the number of enemies his fleet had sent to the bottom. "Victory isn't decided on the map of Europe," he often told his officers. "Victory lies in the numbers, how many tons of cargo we destroy. That is the only true measure of success." By his ruthless calculations, if 800,000 tons of shipping were sunk each month, the British Empire would choke, food supplies cut off, industry paralysed, and the people forced into surrender. That number became a haunting curse in every report and in every restless night of the Admiral's sleep. Young officers recalled how they sometimes caught him sitting alone, murmuring to himself, "Not enough, almost, we need more." Dönitz didn't just want victory, he wanted to strangle the enemy with the invisible hand of the sea. November 1940. In the Lorient base, sirens wailed long and loud. A U-boat, its hull scarred with salt and oil, surfaced and crawled slowly into port. The occupied French citizens watched silently from a distance, while German soldiers cheered wildly. The crew stepped ashore, bearded, hollow-eyed after weeks without sunlight. They raised their arms high as martial music thundered through the air. An officer reported, "Admiral, we have sunk 12 merchant ships carrying a total of 62,000 tons of cargo. Not a single loss on our side." The crowd roared. German newspapers embroidered the story. Invincible sea wolves, the terror of the Atlantic, but behind the empty praise, only the sailors knew the true price they paid. Suffocating air, oxygen running thin, months of life in pitch darkness beneath the waves. All of it was endured for the brief gleam in Dönitz's eyes when he heard the victory figures. To him, every torpedo that hit home was one step closer to the Reich's triumph. One night in June 1941, off the coast of Greenland, Dönitz's wolves fell upon convoy HX-133. Within hours, 10 merchant ships sank, explosions thundering across the night. A surviving British sailor later recalled, "We saw flares light up the sky, then a pillar of fire higher than the mast. The man next to me was gone in an instant, only his shoes were left floating on the water." Berlin radio trumpeted the news. "Another 100,000 tons sunk. The British Empire is bleeding to death." And in Lorient, Dönitz allowed himself a rare smile. He felt that he alone was delivering victory to his nation. But deep inside, he knew it still wasn't enough. "I need at least 300 U-boats to keep up the pace, my Führer," he repeatedly urged Hitler. "With what we have now, we're only scratching the enemy." It will take a true Wolfpack, a massive one, to sink Britain. Hitler listened but remained indifferent. To him, panzers and the Luftwaffe were the real symbols of victory. Goering openly mocked the naval war. "Those little boats? Nonsense. No one wins a war with tin cans crawling under the sea." Dönitz clenched his teeth and endured. He remembered every insult, every dismissal, and each time a U-boat returned with new victories, he wielded the success as a political weapon, forcing the Nazi leadership to acknowledge his role. Yet even during this so-called happy time, warnings began to emerge. A few U-boats were caught by heavily armed escorts equipped with new detection devices, their young crews suffocating inside hulls, crushed by depth charges. March 1941. Gunther Prien, the legend who had sunk the Royal Oak, was killed in an uneven battle with British destroyers. German newspapers still hailed him as an immortal hero, but Dönitz quietly recognized the threat growing beneath the surface. He began demanding more than ever before, greater numbers, new technology, and above all, more enemy convoys wiped from existence. In his private diary, Dönitz wrote, "Each month, the enemy builds hundreds of new warships. If we sink fewer than that, we will lose. Britain must be brought to its knees at any cost. Only then will we win this war." That goal turned him into a ruthless man. To him, the 40,000 U-boat sailors were not flesh and blood men, but pieces in a vast calculation. Meanwhile, outside, changes were quietly underway. The British improved sonar, expanded their bases in Iceland, and most importantly, experimented with ultra-high-frequency radar, compact enough to be mounted on aircraft. Scattered reports of aircraft detecting submarines at unusual distances reached Dönitz. At first, he paid attention, but after reading the files, he dismissed them as fantasy. He believed the ocean was too vast and U-boats too small for any technology to strip away their advantage in darkness. What he did not know was that just 2 years later, that very technology, microwave radar, would crush his dream, turning the Wolfpack he so proudly commanded into a lost flock of sheep drifting helplessly in the sea. A winter night in 1941. The wind howled across the surface of the Atlantic. Among towering waves, a convoy of more than 40 merchant ships crept toward western England. In their holds lay coal, wheat, crude oil, and crates of artillery shells, the lifeblood of an empire being slowly strangled. On the deck of a Canadian freighter, young sailor James O'Connor pulled his soaked coat tighter. The wind lashed his face like a whip, salty and freezing. In the distance, the outlines of other ships faded into grey sea fog. James could see nothing but endless darkness. But he knew that beneath the surface, German phantoms prowled. When the clock ticked past midnight, the slaughter began. From beneath the black water, torpedoes streaked upward, leaving eerie glowing trails. A thunderous explosion ripped through the night. The lead tanker burst apart, a column of flame erupting like a giant torch. The night sky turned crimson, reflected in James's terrified eyes. "U-boat!" someone shouted. Alarm sirens wailed. Sailors scrambled to their posts, but it was already too late. A second torpedo slammed into the starboard side of a wheat freighter. Grain burst skyward, mixing with blood and seawater. Survivors thrashed in the freezing waves, screaming for help. Far off, the escorts tried to respond. They dropped depth charges, steel spheres plunging into the sea, detonating with deep, rolling roars. Water spouted high like geysers. But the ocean was too vast, the U-boats too swift and cunning. They vanished into darkness, only to reappear from another angle and unleash more deadly torpedoes. In a single night, 9 merchant ships went under. Survivors huddled in lifeboats, staring at the burning sea as if watching their own funeral. News raced back to the Admiralty in Whitehall. A hastily scrawled report, its ink smeared by damp, read, "We have lost 52,000 tons of cargo in one night. Convoy SC-42 is nearly annihilated." In a smoke-filled room, Prime Minister Churchill paced heavily, like a wounded bear. On the wall map before him, red numbers bled across the page. January, 300,000 tons. February, 420,000. March, 560,000. Month after month, convoys were torn apart. With each passing day, Britain edged closer to the abyss. "We are being strangled," he rasped, voice thick with fatigue. "If the convoys can't break through those damned U-boats, this nation will starve." On Liverpool's docks, convoys prepared to depart. But the air was heavy, as if the men were marching to a funeral. Every sailor knew the odds of survival were no better than a roll of the dice. An old seaman leaned on the rail, dragging one last cigarette before departure. He said to James O'Connor, You know, lad, the U-boats kill us like a hunter takes down a fish. No hatred, no emotion. That's what makes them so terrifying. James forced a weak smile, but deep inside, fear gnawed at him. Yet even as dread hung over the seas, a spark of hope flickered in secret labs. At Bletchley Park, brilliant minds bent over the Enigma machine, working day and night. As the metal wheels spun, the scrambled letters slowly began to yield. For the first time, the British could read Dönitz's orders, know in advance where the Wolfpacks would strike. But the intelligence was too sensitive. They could not act on it too often, for fear the Germans would suspect and change their codes. Intelligence officers had to grit their teeth, watching convoys slaughtered even when they already knew the danger ahead. At the same time, in shipyards and research facilities, a new technology was being tested: ultra-short-wave radar. Unlike the bulky long-wave sets, this one was compact and powerful, able to be mounted on patrol aircraft. It promised to turn night into day and drag the U-boats out of hiding. However, before the new radar was ready, the Allied Navy still had to live with the nightmare of the Atlantic, a place known by a chilling name: the Black Pit. There, convoys were like abandoned sheep. No patrol aircraft, no escort ships strong enough to protect them, only darkness and fear. And it was in the Black Pit that the U-boats reigned most fiercely. In March 1942, two convoys, HX-229 and SC-122, fell simultaneously into an ambush. A wolfpack of more than 40 U-boats encircled them for 3 straight days and nights. The airwaves crackled with desperate cries for help. "We're going down!" Many dead. "The ship is burning. Please come for us." When the smoke finally cleared, nearly 30 ships were gone. Oil slicks and bodies floated across the surface. It was perhaps the single greatest nightmare of the entire Second World War. After America entered the war at the end of 1941, its ships quickly became the next target. Instead of organising convoys as the British advised, Admiral Ernest King stubbornly allowed merchant ships to sail individually along the American coastline. The result, U-boats surfaced right off New York, firing torpedoes against the backdrop of Manhattan's neon lights. Terrified citizens watched as the sea erupted in flames just offshore. Yet even in those dark days, small victories sparked hope. In 1941, Sunderland aircraft were equipped with the Ley Light, a powerful searchlight that could suddenly blaze on, pinning a surfaced submarine in its beam as it moved in to attack. For the first time, the sea wolves felt what it was like to be hunted. Dönitz received reports. Some submarines were being spotted by aircraft in the dead of night, by means no one could explain. He dismissed it as coincidence and ignored the warnings. He had no idea his era was about to end. February 1940. Birmingham, England. Inside an old red brick building at the University of Birmingham, the tension was so thick you could hear nothing but the sound of breathing. Men in white lab coats, their faces beaded with sweat, crowded around a small steel device laced with glass tubes and tangled wires. Dr. John Randall carefully adjusted a dial, while his colleague Henry Boot held the frame steady, afraid it might shake apart. They were testing the cavity magnetron, a device capable of generating ultra-short waves with astonishing power, something no one had ever believed humans could control. "Ready? Power on!" Randall shouted. A low hum filled the room. The overhead light flickered and the oscilloscope jumped with razor-sharp peaks. Purple light flashed inside the glass tube. An invisible surge of energy pulsed out, so strong that the entire wall trembled. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Boot burst out laughing and grabbed Randall in a bear hug. "We've done it. Short waves, massive power. If we mount this on an aircraft, no submarine will ever escape our sight again." That night, in a cramped little laboratory, Two British scientists had created what would become the ultimate nightmare of the U-boat fleet. When the report reached London, Churchill, just returned to his post as Prime Minister, read every line with eyes gleaming. Obsessed with technology, he had always believed that small inventions could overturn the course of war. "Splendid!" he exclaimed, slamming his cigar down on the desk. "This is the miracle secret." Absolute secrecy. No one outside Britain must know the magnetron was immediately classified as top secret. Churchill ordered mass production, installation on patrol aircraft, and deployment to the battlefield as quickly as possible. But there was a problem. Britain was exhausted. German bombs rained on London, factories lay in ruins, resources were scarce. To turn invention into weapon, they needed the support of an industrial giant, the United States. September 1940. A Hudson seaplane lifted off from a secret British airbase, carrying a package wrapped in plain oilcloth. Inside was a single cavity magnetron, along with a stack of detailed blueprints. The box was handed directly to the Americans in what became known as the British-American Scientific Agreement. When they opened it, American engineers were stunned. "My God, we've never built anything this powerful. This isn't just science, it's magic." From that moment, American laboratories, most famously the MIT Radiation Laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts, plunged into a non-stop race against time. Hundreds of engineers, physicists and technicians poured in, transforming the small British design into a full radar system fit for B-24 bombers and escort ships. At MIT's Rad Lab, the atmosphere felt like a battlefield. Engineers collapsed asleep on their desks, coffee stains spreading across blueprints. They argued over power output, interference, and how to capture signals from ultra-short waves. Some dropped from exhaustion, others scribbled new circuit designs in a frenzy in the middle of the night. One young engineer, Harold Alvarez, later recalled, "We knew that out there people were dying by the minute because of U-boats. Every time we saw news of a convoy going down, we felt partly responsible, like it was our fault for being too slow. So no one complained. We just worked and worked. Each time a radar prototype showed promise, it was rushed to the airfield for testing. Planes roared off into the night, sweeping the sea with pulses of energy. When a tiny dot appeared on the screen, a fishing boat miles away, the entire lab erupted in cheers. If radar could pick up a fishing boat at that distance, then surely it could see a U-boat. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, U-boats continued to spread terror. Allied sailors recalled the suffocating feeling each time they left port. "You know, every voyage feels like stepping into a coffin." "We only hope to see land again," from his bunker in Lorient. Dönitz smiled with satisfaction as reports came in. In June 1942, more than 700,000 tons of cargo had been sunk. He believed that in just a few more months, Britain would be forced to its knees. But just as the Wolfpack was celebrating its triumphs, the first B-24 Liberators fitted with microwave radar took off from Iceland and Newfoundland. One night in August 1942, the Atlantic lay shrouded in darkness. In the cockpit of a B-24, young American pilot Lieutenant Robert Taylor kept his eyes on the horizon. Suddenly, the radar operator behind him shouted, "Contact! 12 miles out, southeast." Taylor squinted into the night, nothing but waves and wind. Yet on the radar screen, a bright dot pulsed clearly. They closed in, then switched on the lee light, the massive searchlight mounted under the bomber's belly. A blinding white beam slashed across the sea. And there it was, a U-boat surfaced, recharging its batteries. German sailors scrambled in panic, blinded, diving for the deck. "Drop depth charges!" Taylor yelled. 4 bombs plunged down, erupting in massive explosions. Water spouted high into the sky. When the spray cleared, only oil slicks and shattered wreckage remained. The crew roared in triumph. They had just witnessed the death of the first U-boat ever hunted down by microwave radar. News of U-boats being ambushed at night by phantom planes left Dönitz bewildered. He could not understand how the enemy had achieved such miracles. "Have they planted spies among us?" he demanded of his intelligence officers. But the only reply was a shake of the head. In his diary, one U-boat captain who narrowly survived wrote, "It felt like we were haunted." In the black of night, suddenly a white light pierced down, then bombs exploded. No one understood it. We no longer trust the darkness. In Britain and America, microwave radar remained the ultimate secret. Pilots were ordered. If shot down, they must destroy the equipment at all costs. In some cases, they were even issued pistols to ensure the device could be smashed before falling into enemy hands. Churchill emphasized, "This is the trump card. One careless mistake and Germany will find a countermeasure. It must be protected with blood if necessary." In 1942 to 1943, two worlds existed side by side. On one side, U-boats still dealt death, pushing Britain toward the brink of starvation. On the other, scientists, engineers and pilots tested each radar set, each circuit, each lee light. Every ship that went down was a reminder that they had to finish their work faster. Every sailor who died at sea was a cry of urgency in the laboratory. And then, once enough aircraft were equipped with microwave radar, the balance began to shift. Convoys that had once been easy prey now had eyes of the gods watching over them. U-boats were detected and hunted down before they could even approach. That secret technological war never made the newspapers, never reached the public's ear. But it was the decisive front. There, no gunfire rang out, only the hum of the magnetron, the scratch of pencils over blueprints, and the weary but determined eyes of the scientists. They had given pilots an invisible weapon, one that turned night into day, that transformed the U-boat from predator to prey. And as 1943 dawned, the outcome became clear: the irreversible collapse of Nazi Germany's Wolfpack fleet. Spring 1943. The Atlantic stretched endlessly, bleak and merciless. For years, night had been the faithful ally of Germany's U-boats. When the sun went down, they surfaced to recharge their batteries, breathe fresh air, and stalk the heavy convoys. Darkness was the invisible cloak that shielded them from enemy eyes. But now the night had betrayed them. Overhead, B-24 Liberators, Sunderlands and Avengers carrying microwave radar patrolled in silence. Inside the control cabins, radar operators stared at glowing green screens, where even the tiniest blip might mean a U-boat gasping for air on the surface. And when the target appeared, the lee light, the giant searchlight slung beneath the aircraft, flared on, turning midnight into blinding daylight. For German sailors, it was the most terrifying moment, stripped bare, with nowhere left to hide. March 4th, 1943, off Greenland. Squadron 86 of RAF Coastal Command was on patrol. Pilot Lieutenant Edward "Ted" Barnes sat tense in the cockpit of his Liberator. Beside him, the radar operator whispered, "Contact, 2 o'clock, 10 miles out." Barnes glanced at his watch. Perfect timing. Midnight, with no moon. If it was a U-boat, it would never suspect anyone was watching. He dropped altitude, radio silent. Wind screamed across the fuselage, engines droned steady. The crew held their breath. Suddenly, the radar operator shouted, "Surfaced!" Moving slow. It has to be one. Barnes gripped the yoke. "Prepare lee light!" The Liberator swept in. In an instant, a searing white beam tore through the night, flooding the ocean below. And there it was, a U-boat, its deck crowded with sailors staggering in the glare. "Drop depth charges!" The bombs screamed down, exploding into towers of water. The U-boat heeled sharply, then erupted, fragments flying in every direction. Above, the crew howled with triumph, hugging each other in disbelief. Within weeks, dozens of U-boats were destroyed in the same way. Night after night, German sailors suddenly found themselves blinded by a deadly white light and pummeled by bombs. Some began calling it Höllenlicht, the light from hell. May 1943. A critical convoy, SC-130, departed Halifax, bound for Liverpool. Dönitz dispatched more than 30 U-boats to encircle it, hoping to crush the convoy and restore his fleet's faltering morale. But this time, the script was reversed. Above the dark ocean, liberators armed with microwave radar swept the seas without pause. Every U-boat that tried to close in was detected. The lee light blazed, depth charges rained down. In just 2 days, 5 U-boats were destroyed. The convoy arrived with barely a scratch. Escort Commander Lieutenant Commander Peter Gretton wrote in his report, "This is the first time we have turned the hunters into the hunted. The U-boat is no longer a ghost. It has become a fish trapped in a glass tank, waiting to be smashed." The news reached London. Churchill allowed himself a rare smile, brushing ash from his cigar. "At last, we found the weapon to blind the Wolfpack." In Lorient, Dönitz turned pale as telegrams poured in. U-402 failed to return. U-258 lost contact. U-438 destroyed. His face twisted with rage. How are the British finding our boats in the dead of night? German engineers scrambled, suspecting a new form of radar, but they could not fathom how the enemy could see from such distances. While they puzzled, U-boats were annihilated one by one without mercy. A young captain, Heinz Schaefer, wrote home, "Mother, I no longer believe in the safety of the night sea. Each time we surface, we are like suicides. We hear the drone above, then the light flashes, and hell opens its gates." Summer 1943. A U-boat was forced to cross the Bay of Biscay to reach the Atlantic. Once a safe passage, it had now become a graveyard. June 20th. A force led by the legendary Commander Johnny Walker, his ship HMS Starling with other escorts, teamed up with aircraft equipped with microwave radar to stage an ambush. The moment the U-boat's shadow broke the surface, aircraft detected it, lee light pinned it, depth charges thundered down. Escorts poured gunfire and laid mines to finish the kill. Within hours, 2 more supply submarines were destroyed. The blow struck at the heart of Dönitz's strategy, for without supply boats, U-boats could no longer roam far into the Atlantic. Sailors called the ambush a fishing trip at sea, for the enemy no longer had the strength to fight back. If once the U-boat had been the terror of British sailors, now it was the German sailors who trembled. Men who had once been eager for duty now looked for ways to avoid it. Some drank themselves unconscious before departure. One captain confessed, "Every time I surface, I can hear my heart pounding louder than the engines." From Berlin, Goebbels' propaganda machine tried desperately to paint a picture of victory, but every man in uniform knew the truth. The tide had turned. With microwave radar, the Allies could now maintain an unblinking eye across the North Atlantic. Patrol aircraft from Iceland, Newfoundland, and escort ships swept the seas constantly. The U-boats no longer had time to recharge their batteries. They could not remain submerged long enough. They were forced to surface, and when they did, the blinding white light returned. Later, historians uncovered a grim tally. In May 1943 alone, 41 U-boats were sunk, the highest number in the entire war. The night, once their ally, had become a death trap. Every flash of a lee light was a death sentence. Every blip on a radar screen meant another submarine doomed to the depths. May 25th, 1943. In the concrete bunker at Lorient, the dim yellow lamp lit the gaunt face of Admiral Karl Dönitz. On his desk lay a stack of telegrams, thick as an indictment. Each sheet of paper represented the death of dozens of men. U-270 failed to return. U-120 sunk, all crew missing. U-450 reported being sighted by white light, then lost contact. To him, it was absolute catastrophe. Each message was a death warrant. He bowed his head, trembling hand covering his eyes. At the naval headquarters, families of sailors gathered. They waited for news of sons, husbands, and fathers. But instead of seeing their men come home, they received only a cold message. Missing, presumed lost. Soft sobs echoed through the bunker. A young widow collapsed when her husband's name was read aloud. An old mother sat in silence, her eyes dry, as though her tears had long since run out. Dönitz understood it all. He knew each cry was a knife to his heart, yet it was also the result of the very strategy he had stubbornly pursued. 2 days later, Dönitz called an emergency meeting in Berlin. Senior officers of the Kriegsmarine sat around the table, their faces heavy with dread. One staff officer finally spoke. "Admiral, the losses are too great. We must suspend operations in the North Atlantic." Another interjected, "The cause is unclear. The enemy seems to have new equipment, radar or spies giving them our positions." The room erupted in arguments. Some blamed the Luftwaffe for failing to provide cover. Others blamed industry for not producing newer submarines fast enough. At last, all eyes turned toward Dönitz. He remained silent for a long time. Then, in a hoarse voice, he said slowly, "We have lost the Battle of the North Atlantic." The room froze. Officers who had grown used to hearing Dönitz's fiery slogans now sat in stunned silence. It was the first time he had ever admitted defeat. When the report reached Hitler, he flew into one of his trademark rages. At the Berghof, the Führer pounded the table, shouting, "Impossible! My Wolfpack cannot be defeated. You are incompetent, or there is treachery." Dönitz stood motionless, head bowed, enduring the storm of fury. He knew Hitler understood nothing of undersea warfare. To the dictator, his forces had to overcome adversity by sheer willpower, and nothing was allowed to stand in their way. When Hitler's shouting subsided, Dönitz spoke softly. "Mein Führer, it is not that my sailors are weak. They fought to their last breath. We are facing a technology far beyond anything we understand." Hitler fell silent, eyes still blazing with anger. But soon he turned to other plans, leaving Dönitz alone with his crushing disappointment. In the U-boat, barracks at Saint-Nazaire, a pall of gloom hung heavy. Survivors sat in silence, eyes vacant. The laughter was gone, the naval songs that once echoed across the docks were gone too. A young sailor whispered, "We're no longer sea wolves. We're just sardines in a can, waiting for the enemy to open the lid." Another gave a bitter laugh. "Worse than sardines." "At least sardines die with their bodies intact. We won't even be granted that mercy." The fear of the Lee light had become a collective nightmare. Many dreamed of the blinding flash, then the bombs, then the cold water swallowing them whole. Some sailors begged to be transferred to other units, but their requests were denied. They all understood. Another patrol almost certainly meant death. Dönitz sat alone in his office, opening the small notebook that had been with him since the beginning. He turned to the page for May 1943. Instead of hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping destroyed, there were only a few dozen, insignificant compared to the losses. And beside it, another figure, cold as a death sentence. 41 U-boats lost. The pen slipped from his hand. He leaned back, staring blankly at the ceiling. All the dreams of victory he had built with his own hands, the strategy on which he had staked his career, his fleet, the lives of tens of thousands of sailors, had dissolved into smoke. One evening, Dönitz summoned a naval engineer. He asked bluntly, "What can we do to counter this new radar?" The engineer hesitated. "Admiral, we are testing a device that might allow a submarine to recharge while submerged. There is also the new all-electric submarine, the Type 21, but it will take at least 2 more years." 2 years. Dönitz let out a bitter laugh. In 2 years, would Germany even exist? Would anyone still be willing to sail? In the days that followed, Dönitz sank into silence. He spoke little to anyone, spending hours staring at maps he knew were now meaningless. In his diary, he wrote, "We have lost our only advantage. The sea now belongs to the enemy. I have turned brave young men into sacrifices for a dream that could never come true." They were rare lines that revealed the despair of the man once called the father of the sea wolves. In Berlin, Goebbels's propaganda machine still blared. The U-boats continue their triumphs. The Wolfpack still spreads terror across the seas. German citizens clapped in movie theatres, watching newsreels staged to show submarines sinking British freighters. The reality was the opposite. The lies only deepened the gulf between the front and the home front. The surviving sailors felt betrayed. They risked their lives, while the government cared only about painting illusions of victory. One morning in June 1943, Dönitz stood before a detachment of sailors about to depart. He looked at their young faces. Most were barely 19 or 20. They shouted, "Heil Hitler!" but their eyes betrayed unease. In that moment, Dönitz froze. He suddenly saw them not as sea wolves of the slogans, but as children thrown into the meat grinder. He knew many of those faces would never return. And for the first time, a feeling he had long tried to bury welled up inside the proud admiral. Guilt. Dönitz had believed he could strangle Britain. But May 1943 had proven the opposite. His career, the pride of Germany, had all been buried under the blinding white glare of the ley light. Summer 1943. Off the North Atlantic, the night lay thick over the sea. Inside the cramped hull of U-616, the crew lay packed together, the smell of oil and sweat heavy in the air. On deck, a few men stole breaths of cool night air. Once, surfacing at night had felt like freedom. Darkness had sheltered them, letting them recharge batteries, observe the slow convoys, prepare for a sudden strike. But now, when they looked up at the sky, all they saw was fear. "We're like fish breaking the surface," one sailor whispered, "just waiting for the enemy to cast the net." They had heard too many stories of U-boats destroyed in an instant. In the minds of U-boat sailors, the lee light had become a nightmare. Some dreamed of standing on deck with a cigarette when suddenly the blinding beam struck and the whole submarine erupted. Others jolted awake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, screaming, "The light! The bombs! We're all dead!" The captain walked the length of the boat, trying to calm his men. "It's all right. Trust me, we will survive." But even he didn't believe his own words. He knew that sailing now was the same as stepping with one foot into the grave. July 1943. A group of U-boats was ordered to intercept convoy HX-239. The sailors were eager, hoping for revenge. But as they closed in, everything was different. The escorts were thick, radar swept constantly, and aircraft circled above, ready to dive at any moment. One U-boat raised its periscope and was immediately spotted. Within minutes, it was surrounded by escorts, sonar pings hammering, depth charges detonating in relentless succession. The submarine exploded before it could fire a single torpedo. In the control room of another U-boat, the operations officer muttered in despair, "We are no longer hunters. The convoy is no longer prey. We are the ones being hunted." The days spent submerged became torture. Batteries drained, the air grew foul, every breath felt like swallowing lead. Sailors thirsted, lips cracked, eyes bloodshot from lack of oxygen. The sonar pings echoing off the hull sounded like nails hammered into a coffin. Each depth charge made the boat shudder violently, bulbs flickering on and off. Some men sobbed, others prayed. Some whispered the names of wives and children. After hours of agony, unable to endure, they were forced to surface. But the moment they broke the waterline, aircraft were already waiting. Microwave radar never slept, and once more the lee light blazed, signalling their death sentence. On another U-boat, a young sailor named Hans Müller scribbled hurriedly into a small notebook. "Dearest mother, I am sorry I cannot keep my promise to return. We have become the hunted. The sea is no longer our friend. Each time we surface, I believe it will be my last. I fear the white light more than death itself. If you receive this letter, I may already lie at the bottom of the Atlantic. But please, mother, do not weep. We have given everything for Germany, even if it was in vain." Hans tucked the notebook into his jacket pocket, but he never had the chance to send it. That night, a British aircraft found them. The lee light cut through the darkness, and the U-boat was torn apart in fire and sea. The Germans had called the years 1940 to 1941 Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time, when the U-boats reigned supreme. But from the summer of 1943 onward, the tide had reversed. Now the Allies called it their happy time, as each night brought the destruction of yet another submarine. In the pubs of London, sailors laughed and raised their glasses to the aircrews who had wiped out the Wolfpack. But in Berlin, the truth was hidden, though everyone in the bases knew U-boats were no longer weapons of destruction, but floating targets. Admiral Dönitz sat in his command bunker, listening to the reports. Each day brought word of more U-boats missing. He snapped at his engineers. "We must have a countermeasure." Some kind of jamming device? Any way to evade radar? The engineers shook their heads. "Admiral, their technology is beyond us. All we can do is refine the snorkel and wait for the Type 21 submarine. But that will take months, perhaps years." It was the same answer he had heard 100 times, yet he kept asking, clinging to the hope of some miracle. But it was only illusion. The terror among U-boat sailors spread quickly. In the beer halls of Hamburg, instead of proud naval songs, men whispered of the ghostly light over the sea. Mothers and young wives wept when they saw sons and husbands march off in sailors' uniforms, for they knew the odds of survival were close to none. Along the Atlantic coast of France, the U-boat bases stood like fortresses: Lorient, Brest, La Rochelle, Saint-Nazaire. Their 5-metre-thick concrete domes could withstand even heavy bombs. The Germans believed these would be impregnable strongholds, from which the Wolfpack could roam freely. Yet, by the summer of 1943, those fortresses had become giant prisons. Allied bombers circled day and night, reducing the surrounding cities to rubble. Submarines struggled to slip out to sea, and, when they returned, it was rarely intact. In the damp darkness, hundreds of sailors shuffled through the concrete corridors. The cheers that once greeted returning crews were gone. Only heavy footsteps and the stench of fuel smoke remained. September 4th, 1944. As the Allies pushed into France after the Normandy campaign, Dönitz was forced to give the order: withdraw all U-boats from the Atlantic bases. The command echoed through the Lorient bunker like a death knell. The officers sat frozen, knowing that all the effort poured into those massive bases, all the blood spilled for them, was now meaningless. A young officer muttered, "We once called this the stronghold of the sea wolves." Now it's a graveyard. The surviving U-boats were ordered to retreat to Kiel, Hamburg, or Norway. It was a voyage of death. The flotillas left port under cover of night, slipping past ruined streets where the occupied French watched silently. Once at sea, they were spotted almost immediately by patrol aircraft. Microwave radar and Allied warship sonar covered every approach. The retreat turned instantly into a massacre. One U-boat was hit by bombs, exploding in front of its comrades. The sailors aboard the others saw only a ball of fire, then a slick of oil spreading across the waves. They knew. Tomorrow, it could be their turn. To cope, German engineers fitted snorkels, breathing tubes that allowed submarines to recharge batteries while submerged. But the technology was crude. The tubes often snapped in heavy seas or left trails of exhaust smoke that radar could easily detect. Sailors complained, "The snorkel just lets us die more slowly." Still, in desperation, Dönitz clung to hope. He pushed for the development of the Type 21, the revolutionary all-electric submarine that could dive longer and faster. But the production lines were bombed relentlessly. By the time the first Type 21 boats were ready, the war was nearly over. In the final days at Brest, chaos peaked. Officers gave orders to prepare for withdrawal, but sailors were in despair. Many drank themselves into unconsciousness, refusing to sail again. Some tried to desert, fleeing into the forests, hunted down by the Gestapo. One veteran captain shouted at his superiors, "Sending them to sea now is nothing but mass execution." But orders were orders, and so, one by one, the U-boats slipped from their pens, slow and doomed like sheep driven to the slaughterhouse. September 12th. A group of 6 U-boats left Lorient. On their way toward Denmark, they were relentlessly hunted by B-24 bombers. Microwave radar picked them up from afar, the lee light flashed, and the bombs rained down. Within 48 hours, 4 were destroyed, and the remaining 2 were badly damaged, limping desperately toward Norway. A surviving sailor recalled, "We weren't fighting anymore. We were just running, and even then it was nearly impossible to escape. Each night was a nightmare, each day an obituary. We weren't sailors. We were just men waiting to die," Admiral Dönitz, who had once proudly declared he would strangle Britain through the tonnage war, now faced an irreversible defeat. He paced in his office, eyes sunken, hair turning grey at an alarming rate. In his diary, he wrote, "I threw those young men into a sea of death. I promised them glory, but gave them only graves. I ask myself, was it the enemy who killed them, or was it me?" By the winter of 1944 to 1945, the remaining U-boats were pulled back into the Baltic. They no longer hunted convoys. They served only to cover desperate retreats or to ferry refugees fleeing the Red Army's advance. On these missions, many were sunk before even reaching open water. Some were destroyed in the shipyards before they were ever completed. The sailors watched without emotion. They had grown as accustomed to death as others to rain or wind. The retreat from the Atlantic marked the end of the U-boat dream. From proud hunters, they had become trembling prey, hiding in the shadows. What had once been the pride of Nazi Germany at sea was now nothing more than a ghost drifting in despair. April 1945. Berlin burned in an inferno, Allied bombs falling like rain. On the Baltic, the last U-boats left Kiel and Hamburg, clinging to the faint hope that they could still do something, anything, for the dying Reich. But these were not hunting voyages anymore. They were escapes. Many were packed with refugees, women and children trying to flee the Red Army. Some carried secret documents or Nazi officials on the run, and some simply sailed out, never to return. The Baltic became a graveyard. Soviet, British, and American aircraft hunted without mercy. Submarines, still on the slipways, were obliterated in bombing raids. The sailors knew, in these last days, they were no longer fighting for Germany. They were fighting only to prolong their lives a few hours more. When the smoke cleared, the numbers stood as cold and final as a death sentence. Nazi Germany had built 1,153 U-boats. Of these, 830 went on patrol. 784 were destroyed. Nearly 30,000 sailors were killed, 2/3 of the entire force. It was one of the highest casualty rates in modern military history. No branch of service endured such devastating losses. People said that joining the German submarine arm gave a man a smaller chance of survival than serving as infantry at Stalingrad. At sea, most of the dead were left without graves. No headstones, no wreaths, only the cold water above them and the slow fading of memory. In Hamburg, after the war, young widows crowded into the ruins of houses. They had nothing but a single sheet of paper declaring their husbands missing. Presumed dead one woman cradled her child and whispered, "Your father lies somewhere out there. We will never find him." They had not only lost their men, but were even denied the chance to mourn before a grave. At Nuremberg, Dönitz was brought to trial. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. When the verdict was read, he stood motionless. He did not fear the prison walls. He feared the souls of the 30,000 sailors he had led to the bottom of the sea. After the war, monuments were raised to honour the sailors who never came back. But for many, they were not symbols of glory. They were warnings. In naval academies afterward, the story of the U-boats was not told as a tale of glory, but as a bitter lesson: never underestimate the power of an enemy's science and industry. For the German sailors who survived, the war ended, but the haunting never did. They carried with them endless nightmares: the flash of the lee light, the relentless ping of sonar, the roar of exploding depth charges, and the screech of steel snapping under pressure. Some could never sleep peacefully again, trembling whenever they heard the blast of a ship's horn or the drone of an aircraft. Some became silent men, never speaking to their families about what they had seen. In their memories, the Atlantic was not an ocean, but an invisible graveyard where their friends, their comrades, and their youth lay buried forever. May 8, 1945. German radio announced the surrender. In the remaining U-boat bases, crews quietly lowered their flags. There was no cheering, no resistance. They simply sat in silence, eyes vacant. An old officer murmured, "So it's over." We lost not because we lacked courage, but because we deceived ourselves about our own strength. Microwave radar, a small invention born in a laboratory, had become the scythe of death, wiping out an entire strategy once hailed as invincible. The end of the U-boats was not just a military defeat, it was a profound lesson. A lesson about the price of blindness, of arrogance. Today, the Atlantic, vast and cold, still roars with its waves, and in every crash of surf one can almost hear the echoes of those lost sailors, souls that never found their shore.